Hello, welcome back to War Mysteries. I'm joined once again, as always, by my brother Matt.
Hello.
I'm Jay. This week we're looking into the missing in action and prisoners of war that were left behind in Vietnam.
MIA.
The Vietnam War claimed between 1.5 million and 4 million lives overall. Obviously encompassing nations outside the borders of Southeast Asia. It's not just confined to Vietnam, which is what a lot of people think.
Vietnam!
So the Vietnam War involved proxy nations, the United States and the Soviet Union, more than any of the others, pitting their military technology and strategies against one another under the guise of foreign assistance. China even got involved at one point as well, but we're going to be focusing on those left behind during the war. Over the course of the conflict, American servicemen, mostly Air Force and Navy, began to seemingly disappear in action without trace, prompting a response from concerned families back mainly in the United States about the recovery of their remains, or if they were prisoners, recovery of the men themselves. The official line by the United States government at the time was to instruct these families to keep quiet and denied any knowledge of prisoners of war or men that were missing in action. During the Paris Peace Accords, however, it emerged that there may actually have been a clandestine deal that was struck between North Vietnam and the United States to recover all remaining MIA in the region. But if so, why didn't this happen? What became of these men? This week, we look into the forgotten souls of Vietnam. So, what do you know about the Vietnam War?
Good music.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you know what that is?
That
You have stood in front of it.
Yeah, it's the Hanoi Taxi.
That's right. It's a C-141 Starlifter known as the Hanoi Taxi. That's what evacuated injured soldiers between February and April of 1973.
What's that got to do with it?
Well, that's just, it's a symbol of the conflict. From the purposes of what we're looking at anyway.
Good.
Let me take you through the background. It's the interesting bit. French colonial interest in Indochina waned in the early 1950s, and American military advisors replaced them, ostensibly with a view to maintaining relations with the Far East that benefited the Western world, or more bluntly, to ensure communism didn't spread any further. That's probably one of the biggest concerns of the United States government at the time was Russia.
Didn't like
Soviet Union. They didn't like the USSR. Following shortly thereafter, the Second Indochina War broke out between North and South Vietnam, with far-reaching consequences for millions of people. The war lasted for nearly 20 years.
Long time.
So what we know as the Vietnam War is actually the Second Indochina War.
Mel Gibson. That's what I think of when I think of Vietnam War.
Mel Gibson. Oh yeah, we were soldiers. You're a knob.
Mel Gibson!
Nothing to do with it. Like less than nothing to do with it. Casualty figures for all nations involved are reasonably agreed upon, but for those that were captured or missing in action, especially the US forces in the region, much controversy surrounds the matter. I mean, they were actually actively denying at the time that there were any people missing at all.
The Americans?
Yeah.
Well, they would, wouldn't they?
Well, yeah.
Bad publicity.
US forces became actively involved following the Gulf of Tonkin incident in 1964 and continued to engage NVA and Viet Cong forces until they began to withdraw from frontline combat in 1971. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, do you know what that is?
No.
Well, there was a US warship, a boat, based in the Gulf of Tonkin.
Mm-hmm.
It was keeping an eye on things, ostensibly. And it was allegedly attacked by torpedo boats of the NVA. Or possibly the Viet Cong. There's a bit of a controversy around that because apparently it didn't actually happen. It was provoked by the US as an excuse to get into the war because they've never done that before. Pearl Harbor. The Paris Peace Accords were conducted in 1973. Among other agreement terms, these talks allegedly outlined financial reparations that America was to pay to North Vietnam, but these were immediately reneged upon, perhaps the reason that so many prisoners of war remained missing in Indochina. The war ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon to Northern Vietnamese forces, resulting in the reunification of Vietnam under a communist banner, but separatist uprisings, civil unrest, and military insurgencies would continue in country until the mid-1980s.
Yeah, they won in the end, didn't they?
Yeah. The southern forces just couldn't hold their own. North Vietnam had China assisting them with not just people but weapons and aircraft. The Soviet Union was there as well.
Full Metal Jacket.
Resulting in the reunification of Vietnam but under a communist banner. So it ruined the country.
Yeah, it created a lot of issues. Still issues, isn't it? It's created a lot of issues.
So there's a lot of background to it, but obviously the bit that we're looking at really is
The bit about this.
those that were missing, yeah. Those that were
About this
missing.
one. This plane.
Not, well,
The Hanoi Taxi. Put that away for now.
yeah, we'll hide. There's no wall anymore, is there? So we'll hide that. So the total missing in action in 1973, 2,642 people that were missing. Still missing now are 1,604.
They found some of them then.
Most were dead, obviously. Casualties, if you want some statistics, the Cambodians lost between 275 and 300,000 people. The Laotians, or Laotians, I don't know how you pronounce that, between 20 and 60,000. The US, nearly 60,000 men.
It's too many people already.
And Vietnam, including civilians, between 1 million and 3.8 million.
1 million and 3.8 million people dead.
Yeah. In total, it's a lot of people. Killed in action.
Right.
So let's go through now a timeline of how exactly it all
Is there a
worked out.
mystery coming up?
There will be, yeah.
Good.
Are you concerned about that?
No, just checking there is one.
There's a mystery. (1950 to 1955). US advisors arrive as French forces leave Indochina. The US assumes financial and military responsibility for South Vietnam. 1959. North Vietnam invades and annexes nearby Laos. Communist guerrilla forces, Viet Cong, begin insurgent action against the pro-US South Vietnam government. 1960. North Vietnam sends support to guerrillas via Laos, eventually beginning military invasion of South Vietnam. 1960 to 1961. US involvement escalates. The MARG program begins. Now, the military assistance advisory. What's MAG? The Military Assistance Advisory Group. That program begins in 1961 for the US. What that basically means is they're going to start bringing troops, equipment, assistance in to help South Vietnam, but not direct involvement yet.
Fair enough.
That's why the boat was in the Gulf of Tonkin at the time.
Born on the 4th of July.
Have you got many more of them?
That's it.
Because have you got a list somewhere? You're just going through them all in your head. What's the next Hamburger Hill? What have you got?
Ooh, that's not a very good one.
It's a great one. 1963. North Vietnamese troop numbers reach 40,000. The US has just 16,000 military personnel inland. People's Republic of China aids North Vietnam with arms, military equipment, and thousands of non-combat troops to free up North Vietnamese forces for combat. In November, Kennedy, an opposition of significant military buildup in Vietnam, is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. 1964. The Gulf of Tonkin incident. US President Lyndon B. Johnson hugely expands US support. Ground combat units are now deployed. 1964 to 1966. US forces reach 184,000. air support is heavily relied upon. The US begins widespread strategic bombing. 1968. The Tet Offensive on January 30th is seen as a turning point in the war. South Vietnam forces are unable to withstand repeated attacks, and US forces take over frontline combat. The Viet Cong suffer heavy losses as a result.
You've got January the 29th written down there.
I haven't, but I'm not going to bother getting the thing up to the camera to prove it.
And this is where they step into combat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Alright.
I mean, they've been doing so in a limited fashion already.
So this is the bit where we get all the great films from.
Yeah. Viet Cong forces then start to suffer heavy losses. Viet Cong is the guerrilla forces, not the army.
It's terrible that they made guerrillas fight, but it is true.
You're really struggling tonight, aren't you? 1969. The Viet Cong are rendered combat ineffective. The North Vietnamese army take over. 1969 to 1970. Bordering areas of Cambodia and Laos are used by the NVA as supply lines. The US bombing of these areas is massively intensified. North Vietnam invades Cambodia, where North Vietnam extends support to the Khmer Rouge, a pro-communist rival government party. 1971. US forces begin to withdraw from frontline combat, allowing resurgent South Vietnamese forces to resume. Heavy fighting continues on both fronts. 1973. The Paris Peace Accords are held on January 27th. The ceasefire lasts just one day. Savage fighting continues throughout 1973 and 1974.
Now, opposition to the war was starting to reach quite an intense level now, wasn't it, back in the States? People didn't want the war going on.
Yeah, it's fair. You know, it was unwanted, really. Obviously with the loss of Kennedy as well, and they realised how many more people were being sent over. Quite sad. 1975. South Vietnamese forces are crippled. Saigon falls to the north. Vietnam is reunified as a communist puppet state, but suffers over a decade of insurgencies. 1976. A report submitted to the US Senate House of Representatives determines that there are no prisoners of war or men missing in action that remain in Indochina.
You want to tell me why?
Well, that was the official line of the government.
Okay.
At the time. To keep it under wraps. An unpopular war, they wanted to move on.
So, I'm looking at what you said, and I'm thinking the best place to jump now in terms of episode moving on would be to look at the individuals that were actually missing in action.
So what we're going to call that bit?
Missing in action.
Charles Shelton, Captain, 5th Tactical Reconnaissance Squadron, April 9th, 1965. Shelton's McDonnell RF-101C Voodoo catches fire during a recon flight over Laos. He ejects safely and makes contact with rebel forces via radio. His rescue, however, is delayed until May 2nd due to bad weather. Subsequently, he's captured by the Pathet Lao guerrilla forces. He was last reported alive in 1968, but was never heard from again. In 1994, he was declared KIA. His wife committed suicide in the early 1990s. Walter Costco, Captain, 563rd Tactical Fighter Squadron, July 27th, 1965. Republic F-105 Thunder Chief aircraft were actually removed from service in Southeast Asia because of very high losses. Costco, piloting one of these aircraft, was hit by anti-aircraft fire over the Phu Tho province in northern Vietnam, causing massive damage to the aircraft. He ejected and landed in the Black River. He was presumed KIA, and no body has been recovered. David Hrodliška, Captain, 563rd Tactical Fighter Squadron, May 18th, 1965. During Operation Steel Tiger over Laos, his aircraft was struck by what is assumed to be anti-aircraft or ground fire. He was captured by Pathet Lao soldiers shortly after. His photo was featured in Quan Doi Nan Danand and also in Pravda in 1966. He was last reported alive in 1968, but is now presumed to be KIA, and his fate is not known. Call sign BAT-21 encompassing Wayne Bolt, Major, Robin Gatwood, First Lieutenant, Anthony Giangeli, Lieutenant Colonel, Charles Levi, Lieutenant Colonel, Henry Serex, Major, and Itziel Hambleton, Lieutenant Colonel, of 42nd Tactical Electronic Warfare Squadron, April 2nd, 1972. BAT-21, a Douglas EB-66 destroyer, was hit by a ground-launched SA-2 missile during the Easter offensive.
Over Easter.
Well, obviously. They wouldn't call it that otherwise, would they?
They call Easter Island, and it's got absolutely subtle to do with Easter.
I'm sure it has somewhere.
Nothing to do with Easter.
What about Christmas Island?
That's all about Christmas. That's where Santa Claus lives.
That's the North... I'm stopping.
Just crack on.
A particularly intense and severe period of combat in early 1972. The flight was conducting Pathfinder support operations for nearby B-52 bombers over the Quang Tri province. Hambleton, the Lieutenant Colonel, was able to eject from the aircraft, but parachuted into NVA-held territory. Attempts to recover Hambleton resulted in 5 further aircraft being shot down, with 11 more men killed as a result. The fate of the other 5 crew members is not known, but they are presumed to have died when the plane crashed. Call sign Nail-89 encompassing Mark Peterson, Lieutenant, and George Morris, Lieutenant. 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron, January 27th, 1973. While conducting forward air control operations in a North American Rockwell OV-10 over Quang Tri province, Nail-89 was struck by an SA-7 missile, which severely damaged the plane. Both crewmen ejected and parachutes were seen. One crew member managed to make contact with rescue forces, but contact was lost soon after. The men were never traced and were presumed KIA, but their fate is not known.
It's cheery.
Yeah.
It's Vietnam War though, isn't it?
So that's 5 different case studies. When the Paris Peace Accords happened, obviously there were some agreements, there were some disagreements. I've got a little bit of a run through, just to bring you up to speed on it all.
Okay.
Happened on the 27th of January 1973. Ordered for the removal of all US forces in exchange for the release of Hanoi POWs in the Hanoi Hilton. You ever heard of that?
Yeah.
Clearing of mines from North Vietnamese Navy ports. Well, the US, because the US put a lot of mines in their ports. A ceasefire in South Vietnam, which happened for a day.
Their election system. I know that they established that.
Withdrawal of foreign forces from Cambodia and Laos. A ban on imported war materials into South Vietnam unless on a replacement basis.
Yeah, I don't know if that actually worked out, did it?
Couldn't tell you, I wasn't alive.
I'll look into it.
Next we're looking into is the alleged secret clause in the Paris Peace Accords. Evidence has surfaced that a secret additional clause was included in the Paris Peace Accords and was negotiated by Henry Kissinger on behalf of President Nixon. It would have involved a $4 billion deal with North Vietnam to recover US prisoners and remains, but was allegedly immediately disregarded by the US, resulting in no transfer of personnel. In 1992, witness testimony was made public from Richard Allen, a former national security advisor to Reagan in the White House, and seemed to indicate that during a discussion with foreign advisors in 1981, a further opportunity was made available by North Vietnam to the United States via a third country, promising much the same as the original agreement. All remaining prisoners of war would be freed in exchange for the $4 billion, conveniently to be labelled reparations. Allen described the number of prisoners of war offered as dozens, possibly into the hundreds. When it became clear that Allen would receive no support from other witnesses to this discussion, he withdrew his statement. The director of the CIA at the time labelled the Vietnamese suggestion as blackmail, and the Washington Times printed a story quoting then President George Bush, who described the situation as a lost cause. Given the number of prisoners of war in question, a bribe of $4 billion would put a colossal individual price on the freedom of each prisoner, which it is alleged the US was simply not willing to pay. They did eventually admit it, just in case I haven't mentioned that. They did admit.
Well, people are going to get left behind, didn't they? There were loads of them over there. But what you're saying is, a lot of people went missing.
Hundreds of people went missing. We've got a few facts. Let's have a look. See what we've got. So, still, as of 2017, still technically missing 1,604 different people. 1,026 of these are labelled further pursuit, now that they've admitted that they actually exist. 488 are labelled no pursuit, 90 deferred until a later agreement. So there are technically at least another 1,000 people still out there somewhere, either dead or interred.
Or just wandering around the jungle.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's 35 years later now, isn't it? So,
apocalypse now.
Yeah. There is more we'll go into.
Good.
Really, all that's left to discuss is the legacy. The key issue surrounding the controversy in the present day is, of course, do any more prisoners remain? Given the total losses suffered in the war by all concerned, the later denials from all sides, and the subsequent revelation that personnel were in fact left behind by the United States, it is not surprising that focus groups continue to campaign for investigations and research geared towards bringing the remaining people back to their families. As time passes, the likelihood of recovery dwindles, and many families have been forced to come to terms with the knowledge that their missing loved ones may never return. In fairness to the US military, if not those in government office, extensive efforts were undertaken to recover men in the field, as in the case of Hambleton of Bat 21. It will likely never be known for certain if the secret clause was included in the peace accords, and if the subsequent bargaining offered in 1981 was dismissed out of hand, or indeed offered at all. Something that cannot be refuted, however, is that prisoners of war were indeed held after the US left Vietnam. A former Vietnamese secret policeman came forward to claim that thousands of Americans were kept imprisoned beyond 1973, and President Reagan himself wrote to the wife of Bobby Garfield, who was captured by the Viet Cong in 1965, to tell her that a rescue attempt had in fact been made in 1981. This directly contradicted the official line of the US government at the time, that no Americans remained in Southeast Asia. This revelation, however, is of little comfort now. The truth is that lies and deception from all angles likely catalysed the loss of over 1,000 servicemen, people who realistically may have been recovered at the time had better efforts been made and their existence acknowledged. Sadly, more than 30 years later, it is extremely unlikely that any remain alive. So that's that's the controversy surrounding the MIA issue. Still ongoing to this day, of course.
Were people out there in helicopters?
Well, probably not, no.
So that was Vietnam then? Yeah, it was, well, it wasn't a very popular war, was it? Despite the fact that it stimulated some fantastic films. Mystery solved. Although if you can pick the mystery out of the last episode, which is...
I don't know why I put them here, because you just end up playing with them. You told me off for playing with them.
Mel Gibson.
No, because that's not a Huey. Oh, Jesus. We talked about this.
Back for the...
We don't need it. Why is that here?
It's just as
why have you
useful
put
as
a zip
anything
tie
else.
on it? Is that because Ed pulled the pin out?
No,
He did pull the pin out, though,
in
didn't
the
he?
garage.
Nearly killed us.
Yeah.
Charming. So thank you for watching this one. Obviously, we'll be back with another Cold War episode, hopefully sooner than last time. So we'll see you in the next episode. In the meantime, follow us on Instagram, which is down here. Obviously, give us a like if you think we've earned it. Make sure to check out our new series of Declassified, which is ongoing in conjunction with this series. We've got a few more episodes coming out in the next couple of weeks. You enjoy them, don't you?
I love them. Actually, I listen to one every day.
It's where 50% of our views come from. We like to stimulate conversation, so obviously if you have any questions you want to ask us, perhaps ideas for episodes in the future, put them down in the comments below. We always try our best to answer as many as we can. But yeah, so what would you do if you were left in Vietnam?
I'm not sure, actually. It's a good question. I suppose if I'd been left behind, I would probably have found a way to survive. Yeah.
Now I'm going to get missing in action.
That's a wrap.
I'm hungry. Leave you here.